Hey, thanks for joining me. This is my first video in a series I'm titling An Atheist Teaches the Bible. And if you want to know more about my background and my philosophy, I'll share a link to a podcast episode that I did where I talked about what I believe God is and what God represents. And a little bit more about my background, if you're curious about that. But I think that in our times right now, it is important to take a look back at some of the writings in the Bible. And the reason being is that, good or bad, right, wrong, or indifferent, many of the traditions and beliefs and foundations that we have within Western society were built on the philosophies and teachings that came from the Bible. And also, some of these are just very timeless. And if you follow me on TikTok and if you follow me on YouTube for a while, then you'll know that I'm also a student of the Tao Te Ching. And in fact, I'm doing a series on TikTok where I'm just reading through it. And I've taught the Tao Te Ching several times over the years. And it always struck me how very Taoist the Bible was, especially Jesus' teachings. And in fact, there's a book, I'll provide a reference to it that compares Jesus' teachings to Taoism. It's a really interesting study, and on the theory that, Jesus was heavily Taoist in his influences and the teachings and the things that have been passed down to us in the writings. And I know that there's some debate about the writings and the scriptures and all this other kind of stuff. I don't want to get into that stuff right now. What I want to talk about is the book of Matthew, because we're in a period of turmoil and strife in the nation right now. There's protests all over the place. There's a lot of hatred and back and forth and finger pointing and name calling, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on out there. And it's very easy as humans to let those emotions start to escalate. It's very hard to de-escalate that kind of thing. And I believe that for a lot of people, it could be something as simple as just looking back at the teachings of Jesus. Get rid of all the other stuff. Forget about the Old Testament stuff for now. Forget about the letters that Paul wrote for now. And just look at the Gospels, And so the beginning of this series is going to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Thomas, and possibly Mary, and some of the other Gospels that they've found. And just to kind of elaborate on them and what was the original intention of Christianity and how did it work. Because I think those are really important things to understand, especially in those times. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, please join along. But right now, given this time of protest, I think one of the most important things that we can do is look at Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. Because that's something that we really desperately need in our country right now. So I'm just going to read to you real quick Matthew chapter 5. And verse 43 and following. And I'll just kind of unpack that a little bit from a psychological point of view, from a philosophical point of view, from a Taoist point of view. So here we go. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 and following. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You, therefore, must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. it's like I said, it's so easy to retaliate, and this teaching comes right on the tails of the teaching of turning the other cheek. Now, and also the concept that the meek shall inherit the earth. So there's two important concepts to unpack there with turning the other cheek and the meek inheriting the earth. The first one I want to talk about is the meek and what the term meek means. I'll provide some reference links in this, in the description, but let's just say that a good definition of the word meek from the original language is something like what Teddy Roosevelt used to say, that we should speak softly and carry a big stick. So in our modern interpretation, our modern language, we've often come to understand the word meek as being sort of humble and timid and, shallow-chested and just silly and kind of weak, And that's so often what you picture. But that's not what you should picture at all. What you should picture is somebody like maybe a Joe Rogan, or maybe a Jordan Peterson, or maybe The Rock, That would be a meek person, which seems strange, because it's not at all what you picture. Because what it is somebody who is a giant in physical stature, maybe, or in intellectual stature, and knows how to use their physical or intellectual prowess to create real damage. Real damage. But they've developed a level of self-control so they know that they don't have to. And that's what being meek is. Being meek is how we won the Cold War. We were we were robust. We had more nukes than anybody else, and people knew that we weren't afraid to use them because we'd used them in the past. But we didn't have to. And it's kind of that concept. And the other idea that goes along with that, though, with meekness, is that in order to be meek, you have to have not only developed your physical and intellectual prowess to a point where you are an intimidating force just by nature of your very presence, but you have to have also simultaneously developed your spiritual awakening or your internal emotional security or your internal emotional intelligence, so that you've achieved a level of wisdom that is commensurate with that level of strength, right? So right now in Washington, D.C., we're seeing a man-child with nuclear codes and access to, the clout of the United States military. But he's a man-child. He is not meek. He's not going to inherit the earth. And the people like him are toppled all the time. Happens every time they pop up, they get toppled. So rest assured, Donald Trump will go away. And, anyway, I'm not going to go down that route. It's so hard to not talk about Donald Trump. What are we doing? All right. So meek. Okay, so I talked about meekness. Now, the other thing is the concept, I mentioned this at the beginning, the concept of turning the other cheek. Now, it's important to kind of marry those two ideas in your head, the idea of meekness and the idea of turning the other cheek. Because what turning the other cheek signifies is that same level of maturity that I was speaking about, right? So if the meek are going to inherit the earth, then it's the meek people who are willing to take the slap on the cheek and then take the other slap on the cheek, right? So it's somebody like a Joe Rogan if you slap him on the cheek, he could just kill you, you know? I'd go up to the rock and slap him on the cheek. Yeah, it's not going to go well for you. Or, well, potentially. Because he's huge. He's a monster. But he knows his strength, right? So you see all those debates with Jordan Peterson when, before he fell ill. And people would, verbally slap him across the cheek. And he didn't attack back. He didn't lash out. He took it and he processed it. And then he redirected the conversation to where he wanted it to go. So it never became a thing where he got slapped across the cheek and then, attacked back. It was like, okay, slap me across that cheek. All right, I'll process that. Slap me across this cheek too. Because what that implies is that you can take it once and you're so confident in your ability to take it once that you can take it again. It's like, come at me, bro. Come at me, bro. Slap me on the cheek. I can redirect that energy and I can turn that back into love. Slap me across the other cheek. I can redirect that energy and I can turn it back into love. And that's what we can do, and that's what we can move forward. And there's a second concept that goes along with turning the other cheek that is, it kind of applies simultaneously. And it's this idea of an awareness that you made a mistake in your delivery of your belief or your delivery of your behavior or some way that you interacted in the world and you asked for it, right? So in the Tao Te Ching, it says that good walking leaves no footprints, right? And it's the idea that if you are, or it says a master tailor can sew without making too many cuts in the fabric, things like that. And but it's the idea that if you are speaking well, if you're speaking kindly, and you're speaking from a place of love and from truth, then nobody's going to be able to refute the things that you're saying, right? I mean, they can try. But if you're coming from a place of truth and love, and you're doing it well, and you're doing it skillfully, then the words that you speak aren't going to leave anybody itching or discombobulated, It's like the difference between listening to Sam Harris, say, and listening to Donald Trump. If you listen to Donald Trump for too long, he'll lower your IQ points. Whereas if you listen to somebody like Sam Harris, it's very difficult to refute the things that he says because he's very articulate and very concise. Some of his larger blocks of information and doctrine and the places where it comes from, maybe you could dismantle those a little bit. Maybe you could talk about those a little bit. But it's very hard to come at somebody like Sam Harris and expect to be able to, dominate him in a debate. And so the concept then of turning the other cheek is that if you are the person who's in a position like Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, The Rock, and you are delivering, right, your idea, or you are acting out yourself in the world, and you make a legitimate mistake, right, something you didn't account for, or you weren't watching your steps, or you weren't being accountable for your words, right, and somebody slaps you across the face for it, you have to have the willingness then to say, yeah, I deserve that. Here, get me here too, so that I'll remember, right? And it's that level of maturity and wisdom where if somebody slaps you across the face, you say, oh, yeah, I screwed up. Hit me again so that I remember, so that I don't forget that again. Does that make sense? It's a difficult concept to understand, but it's one that's where wisdom comes from. The willingness to be able to do that. And you learn very quickly that you didn't like getting slapped once, and you like getting slapped twice even less, so that you begin then to develop your wisdom. You begin to develop your skills, delivering your message and acting, behaving in the world. So anyway, so what does any of that have to do with loving your enemies? If you have developed yourself to a place, and this needs to be the goal, right? This needs to be the goal that you seek to achieve throughout the process of life. From the time you're born to the time you leave the earth, you should be striving to move forward. I forget, there's a Buddhist teacher that I listen to, but he was talking about the fact that all life strives to move upward. Like worms, they crawl up to the surface, and birds, launch up into the sky, and a human, wants to go from nothing and be able to expand and buy a house and do things, and it's all about moving upward. And this teacher, I'll find a link and I'll put it into this video so you can see what I'm talking about. But he said even a person who's a thief is striving to move upward, because his view of what is upward and your view of what is upward may be different, but they're still striving to move upward. A thief is trying to get cash so that he can move from the place where he is to a higher place of having food or having a house or having the things, and maybe he's got bad ideas about how to do that kind of thing, but it's that movement upward that we all have, right? So the level of wisdom that we need to be seeking after throughout our process of life is that moving upward, and the upward movement that we should be striving for, that level of wisdom is to achieve the level of meekness, as we defined it before, where you have the wisdom which would allow you to receive a slap on the cheek for saying something wrong, be willing to take the second slap on the cheek, and in both cases, turn those into a loving situation, turn that back around into love, so that you can continue to grow in wisdom. And one of the things that you can do, both when you achieve that and when you practice to be able to get to that level, is this: to love your enemies, right? So, you have heard that it is said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And that's the idea. That's the practice that you start to go through so you can achieve that level of meekness and achieve that level of wisdom, right? Now, look at the last verse down at the bottom, 48. It says, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Okay? And that's an inachievable goal. How can I be perfect the way that your heavenly Father is perfect? That's God. Ooh, what am I going to do? Well, remember that a lot of Christ's teaching were very Taoist in their nature. And one of the concepts within Taoism is that you should be striving to move towards the Tao. You should be living according to the Tao. Which is the way. It's the ethereal thing. I think it's the first section in the Tao says that which can be named is not the eternal Tao, right? And that's the perfection that you should be striving for, that growing up, that coming out, that every living thing is striving to become, is the Tao. It's the perfection of the Tao, right? Now, I know there's going to be a lot of questions about the Heavenly Father and all sorts of kind of stuff. I did a separate podcast about that where I talked about the masculine nature of God and why that's important, and I'll delve into that a little bit more later on. But for now, there is method to why it's referred to in a masculine, and once you hear it, it makes a lot more sense. So if that kind of is a burr in your saddle, I will get to that, okay? So, but this passage here is, we need this so much in our times. We need this so badly in our times. We need wisdom. We need meek men and women who are willing to stand up for what's right. We need meekness in the police force. We need meekness in the White House. Ouch. I just punched my keyboard. And this is a theme I'm going to talk about throughout all my videos. You'll hear about it all the time. Is that all of this meekness begins with you, and it begins with me. Because one of the things that we know is that the world that we see outside of us is a projection of what is going on inside of us. So, if you see things on the outside, if you see hatred and racism and fear and all these sorts of things on the outside, guess what you're seeing on the inside? Right? You're projecting that out. So the things that are going on in the world are a collective projection, collective manifestation, if you will, of the things that people are feeling in their hearts right now, right? Some people say that, the media is manipulating us and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into that right now. But if you want to change the world, like Mahatma Gandhi said, it's not just a matter of being the change that you would like to see in the world. It's about realizing that you are projecting the world out there. And we all are, collectively. So it begins with you. And it begins with me. Changing the way that we see things. Changing the things in our own hearts. Right? Because everything comes down to the individual. The individual is so, so important. Not the collective. The collective has its purposes. Right? Or also, since we're thinking about the yin and the yang and the Tao, the collective can be the individual, just as the individual can be the collective. Can you see that? Anyway, thanks for listening. I appreciate your time very, very much. Please do like and subscribe, and follow along. This is a series I've been thinking about doing for a long, long time, and I just think the time has come now. So love you much. Hope you got something out of this. Like, share, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.